Welcome to everyone. And Matthias, a special welcome to you. I'm in Bloomington. You're in Germany. Thanks to the miracle of Zoom, here we are together. But Bloomington is a town you know well. If I'm not mistaken, you've been literally to every conference on anti-Semitism that we've hosted, and this goes back over a number of years, which says what? We follow your work very closely, admire it, learn from it all the time. I don't yet have a date for our next conference. Take for granted you'll be invited to it.
Hmm.
For those of you who don't know Matthias Küntzel, he's a political scientist and historian based in Germany. He's a widely published author. His latest book I have in front of me. It's called Nazis, Islamic Anti-Semitism, and the Middle East. I strongly recommend it to all of those who want to know more about the 1948 Arab war against Israel and what came after the aftershocks of World War II. If I have it right, this book is the third book that Dr. Küntzel has published. Another one, which I likewise recommend, is Jihad and Jew Hatred. I often refer my own students to this. It has to do with Nazism and the roots of a particular kind of evil, contributed for sure to 9/11, continues to contribute in our own day to the rise of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. In other words, the person we're featuring today is a veteran scholar of anti-Semitism, particularly focused on Islamist anti-Semitism, an area that we all need to learn a lot more about. Matthias, it's now my pleasure to turn over to you.
Thank you very much, Elvin. Thank you very much, Günther. It's always a big honor to be invited by you to participate in this really astonishing series of webinars. Allow me to begin with a personal story. In the months after 9/11 2001, when I was preparing my book, Jihad and Jew Hatred, I discovered the complete English translation of the Hamas Charter. In 2002, I published important parts of this charter in my book. In 2004, Professor Omar Bartov published an essay in the journal The New Republic that repeatedly referred to my person and to my book and quoted extensively from the Hamas Charter. In 2004, Bartov was already an important historian of the Wehrmacht and the extermination camps, and he was able to read the German version of my book. In his essay of 2004, Bartov described the Charter of Hamas as, I quote, the most explicit and frightening link between Hitler's anti-Semitism and the contemporary wave of conspiracy theories, end quote. He emphasizes, quote, the charter of the Hamas movement contains the most blatant anti-Semitic statements made in a publicly available document since Hitler's own pronouncements. There is a Hitlerite quality of the new anti-Semitism, end quote. Then came the day when Hamas created hell on earth in southern Israel. What occurred was not just a declaration of war on Israel and the Jews, but the announcement of their elimination. The burning of whole families, the mutilations, the most brutal rapes and tortures, all this was not the work of common murderers killing out of greed or self-interest, but of radical Jew haters in whose eyes every Jew is guilty because he is a Jew and who therefore see themselves as pursuing a noble and higher mission, making the world Jew-free. Our mission was only to kill, killing without distinguishing between men, women, and children. Kill anyone you see, as one participant subsequently explained. On October 7, the Hitlerite quality of the new anti-Semitism of which Bartov spoke ran riot. I was all the more surprised, no, horrified, when I read Bartov's statements after the massacre of October 7. In an interview with the Frankfurter Rundschau, a daily in Germany, about the roots of this massacre, Bartov made no mention of Hamas anti-Semitism, as if no such thing existed. By doing so, he gave the impression that the onslaught on Israel had nothing to do with Jew hatred. Instead, he attributed responsibility for the atrocities solely to Israel and, I quote, the oppression of millions of Palestinians, end quote. While Bartov in his 2004 essay still emphasized the frightening link between Hitler's anti-Semitism and the contemporary Jew hatred, he claimed in 2023 the opposite. He criticized any attempt to link Hamas terrorism and the Holocaust in any way. Just 1 week after the massacre, he described such comparisons as, I quote, false, erroneous, and ideologically driven, end quote. It did not stop there. On the 20th of November 2023, Bartov issued an open letter on the misuse of Holocaust memory, together with other well-known authors such as Christopher R. Browning, Michael Rothberg, and A. Dirk Moses. Here, the signatories voice their opposition not only to abuses of the memory of the Holocaust, abuses which do exist and which deserve criticism, but also to any reference to Nazism and the Holocaust in efforts to understand the roots of the October 7 massacre. They admit that the massacre did remind many Jews of the Shoah and also of earlier pogroms. At the same time, they vehemently reject such associations. I quote, comparisons of the crisis unfolding in Palestine. Yes, they repeatedly refer to the Hamas massacre as a crisis unfolding in Israel-Palestine. Comparisons of the crisis unfolding in Israel-Palestine to Nazism and the Holocaust are intellectual and moral failings, end quote. A comparison, however, is not an equation. Of course, October 7 was not an Holocaust. Of course, Hamas terrorists are not the new Nazis. Anyone, however, who wants to get to the roots of the ideological origins of the Hamas attack cannot avoid the issue of the Nazis' Jewish policy and its legacy in the Arab world. For there are indeed clear lines of continuity linking the anti-Jewish terror of the Nazis with that of the Hamas. I would like to point out three of these connecting threads. Firstly, with every mass murder of Jews, as with every attempted mass murder, again, firstly, with every mass murder of Jews, as with every attempted mass murder of Jews, as in the synagogue in the Berlin town of Halle, the memory of the Holocaust is unavoidable. You cannot escape this memory. For Jews, it occurs as re-traumatization, as proof that the time of deadly persecution is not over. For anti-Semites, on the other hand, this memory is an incentive and proof that the mass killing of Jews is possible. What happened can happen again. And it shall happen again, demand leading Muslim Brotherhood ideologues such as Said Qutb and Yusuf al-Qaradawi. Hamas is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. Qutb and Qaradawi described the Holocaust as a just punishment from God and called for it to be repeated this time by Muslims. I, these are the words Qaradawi shouted out to the millions of viewers of the TV channel Al Jazeera in early 2009. I quote, "Throughout history, Allah has imposed upon the Jews people who would punish them for their corruption. The last punishment was carried out by Hitler. He managed to put them in their place. This was divine punishment for them. Allah willing, the next time will be at the hand of the believers." End quote. In this passage, Qaradawi claims that the Jews brought about the Shoah because of their corruption. However, Hitler succeeded in punishing them. Furthermore, while the murder of millions was divine punishment, it was not enough. A further punishment is necessary this time to be meted out by the Muslims. So, in all seriousness, Qaradawi announced a new Holocaust and the end of Israel as a religious mission and Allah's command. We see it is unavoidable that the Nazi Holocaust plays a role in such manifestations of contemporary anti-Semitism, either as an extreme horror scenario that must not happen again, or as a model that needs to be repeated. Secondly, some passages of the Hamas Charter of 1988, which is still in force, are taken verbatim from the Nazis. This charter, quote, sounds as if it was copied directly from the page of the Stürmer, remarked the Palestinian politician Sari Nusaybi, and he was right. I quote from this charter. They, the Jews, stood behind the French and the communist revolutions and behind most of the revolutions we hear about here and there. They stood behind the First World War, where they managed to eliminate the state of the Islamic Caliphate. And they also stood behind the Second World War, where they made huge profits from their trade in war materials. There was no war that broke out anywhere without their fingerprints on it. Their scheme has been laid out in the protocols of the elders of Zion, and their present conduct is the best proof of what is said there, end quote. The similarity of words and tropes, here on the part of the Nazis, there on the part of Hamas, is significant, for the paranoid pattern that becomes visible here culminates in both cases in a hatred that denies that the Jews are part of humanity. Thirdly, the ideological history of Hamas is also linked to Nazi policy in the Middle East. Already during the 1930s, the parent organization of Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, was receiving Nazi money from Berlin. Nazi agents devoted themselves to educating the Muslim Brotherhood's leadership, organizing joint Palestine meetings, and even training sessions on the Jewish question. Newly discovered archival sources reveal that the highest levels of the Nazi leadership took a keen interest in this cooperation with the Muslim Brotherhood. Quote, and likewise, Goebbels had spoken about it with much praise. As early as 1937, 11 years before the foundation of Israel, a pamphlet entitled Islam and Judaism was published in Arabic that combines the Jew hatred of early Islamic sources with elements of European anti-Semitism. The Nazis would subsequently distribute it in the Muslim world in large quantities and different languages. Then, in April 1939, the Nazis began radio broadcasts in Arabic language that would disseminate Goebbels' anti-Semitic anti-Zionism in the Arab world on a daily basis until April 1945. This 6-year nightly barrage by the Nazis proved to be a caesura that divides the history of the Middle East into a before and an after. Thus, after 1945, Arab leaders repeated many of the anti-Jewish and anti-Zionist slogans that had been disseminated by the Nazi radio in the past. Decades later, the seeds sown by the Nazis and Islamists would sprout. The few years of exposure to Nazi ideology brought about a long-lasting change in the Arab world. To this day, only the anti-Jewish passages of the Quran are incessantly repeated there. To this day, the course of events is interpreted through the lens of the protocols of the elders of Zion. To this day, the Palestinian Authority views every attempt to normalize relations with Israel as high treason. To this day, the Palestinian leadership remains committed to the legacy of Amin al-Husseini. This last point is quite crucial. Left liberal opponents of Zionism do not want to talk about it because the Mufti's policies prove how strongly anti-Zionism and the Third Reich were linked. Amin al-Husseini, who lived until 1974, worked tirelessly to turn the limited territorial conflict in Palestine into an unlimited religious life or death war between Jewry and Islam. He silenced the moderate Arabs of Palestine through pure terror. In Berlin, where he lived between 1941 and 1945, the radical nature of his hatred of Jews astonished even die-hard Nazis. As an active supporter of the Shoah, he had repeatedly fought with his German superiors in order to block Jews from escaping their death. Amin al-Husseini was also a member of the SS, with the rank of SS Gruppenführer, the fourth highest rank of the SS in the German Reich. The Mufti recruited the Bosnian Muslim SS division Handschar, which had fought in the Yugoslav partisans, with extreme cruelty and hunted down Jews in Croatia. However, despite the Mufti's terrible crimes, and despite major anti-Nazi campaigns against the Mufti, the Allied victors of World War II refused to indict him as a war criminal and risk conflict with the Arab world. This decision had serious consequences for the region. According to Jeffrey Herf, I quote, "The absence of a trial and punishment enabled the leading voice of Arab extremism and radical anti-Semitism to be welcomed home to the Middle East as a hero of an anti-imperialist struggle rather than as a disgraced collaborator with Nazism and its crimes against the Jews," end quote. In 1946, the Muslim Brotherhood, whose membership had risen to over 1 million, hailed the Mufti as a man who would realize Hitler's dream and continue to fight Zionism. And indeed, it is Amin al-Husseini who embodies the connection that exists between the Nazi war against the Jews, which ended in 1945, and the Arab war against Israel, which started in 1948. However, just as the Mufti never distanced himself from the Nazis, no Palestinian leader has ever distanced himself from the Mufti. Yasser Arafat, the Mufti's preferred successor, extols the Mufti as a hero whose soldier he had been. Arafat's successor, Mahmoud Abbas, has referred to al-Husseini as a hero and pioneer as well. In July 2019, Mahmoud al-Habash, one of Abbas' closest advisors, posted a photo of the Mufti on his Facebook page and praised him as leader and example. This partisanship and its continuity from al-Husseini to Arafat to Abbas and to Hamas is a major reason why Islamist and European Jew hatred has maintained a shadow over the Middle East to this day. Completing the picture are recent discoveries made by Israeli soldiers in the Gaza Strip, such as a book by Hamas founder Mahmoud al-Azhar entitled The End of the Jews, which praises the Holocaust and calls for it to be completed, or Arabic editions of Mein Kampf, which recently reached number 6 on the Palestinian bestseller list. Let me now repeat the quote from the open letter by Omar Bartov et alteri. Quote, comparisons of the crisis unfolding in Israel-Palestine to Nazism and the Holocaust are intellectual and moral failings, end quote. How do outstanding scholars such as Browning and Bartov come to such an assertion? Why this effort to discourage others from becoming fully informed about October 7? At least their open letter provides a clue. It states, I quote, appealing to the memory of the Holocaust obscures our understanding of the anti-Semitism Jews face today. Again, appealing to the memory of the Holocaust obscures our understanding of the anti-Semitism Jews face today and dangerously misrepresents the causes of violence in Israel-Palestine. This key remark of the open letter is remarkable for two reasons. It assumes, firstly, that the anti-Semitism that Jews are facing today has little or nothing to do with the Jew hatred that culminated in the Holocaust. This is, as we have already seen, false. The ideological, historical, and semantic connections that link the anti-Semitism of Hamas to that of the Nazis, and the scholarly literature that presents these connections can now be ignored only if one is desperate to do so. Moreover, anyone who downplay or screen out Hamas' radical anti-Semitism has to find another explanation for its terrorism. So the blame is placed on Israel. And if Israel is ultimately to blame, then the logical consequence is that the more terrorism, the greater will be Israel's guilt. Such twisted logic has surely made a major contribution to the fact that the unparalleled anti-Semitic crime of October 7 has been followed by an unparalleled wave of hatred of Israel and anti-Semitism. Such twisted logic also trivializes the Jew hatred in the Arab world by attributing putatively rational motives to it. An example of this downplaying was provided by Gilbert Achcar, a professor at the London-based School of Oriental and African Studies. Achcar does not deny the existence of Arab anti-Semitism. Instead, he makes solely Israel responsible for it. He sees in Arab anti-Semitism only, I quote, fantasy-laden expressions on an intense national frustration and oppression for which the Jews of Palestine in their majority, as well as Israel, the Jewish state they founded, must in fact be held responsible, end quote. He therefore wants to sharply distinguish between a pathological European anti-Semitism and the frustration-based expressions of the Arabs. However, were we to examine these expressions more closely, we would soon see that they are violent fantasies directed at the destruction of the Jews or Israel. Such fantasies have nothing to do with real conflicts. Otherwise, the response would not be anti-Semitism, but a justified or unjustified fury over a misguided policy aimed at changing behavior, not annihilation. Ashkar, like many of his colleagues, defends the dogma of discontinuity, that is, the thesis that there is no connection at all between Hitler's hatred of Jews and Islamists' hatred of Israel. This thesis has contributed and continues to contribute hugely to the widespread refusal to take the radical Jew hatred of the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas seriously. It has thus facilitated the October 7 massacre. The dogma of discontinuity is based on two errors that are closely connected. Firstly, Hamas crimes are detached from their ideological sources and thus pardoned or rationalized. And then, secondly, a space is created for the expression of a classic trope of modern anti-Semitism, the assertion that Jews are responsible for their own persecution. The dogma that Israel is to blame is based on the dogma that there is no link between the anti-Semitism of Hamas and that of the Nazis. One is a precondition for the other. Let us now return to the open letter of Bartov et alteri, according to which referring to the Holocaust also, I quote, dangerously misrepresents the causes of violence in Israel-Palestine, end quote. Is it dangerous to relate my knowledge of the Holocaust to October 7? And if so, what precisely is the nature of this danger? The open letter itself provides us with a clue. While Hamas massacre is referred to repeatedly by the euphemism of the current crisis, the signatories place the blame for the widespread killing solely on Israel, whose history is deemed responsible for the, I quote, spiral of violence. There is no military solution in Israel-Palestine, they wrote just a few weeks after October 7, without explaining how Hamas' murderous rampage could have been stopped without the use of military force. It thus becomes clear why they find references to the memory of the Holocaust not only false, but dangerously so. It is because it would undermine the dichotomy between Zionist perfidy on the one hand and innocent Palestinian victimhood on the other, the dichotomy to which they are deeply committed. Benjamin Netanyahu and his military policy are often criticized, in my opinion, deservedly so. On the other hand, no argument can justify lack of clarity about the real threats to Israel and ignorance of the real ideology of its enemies. Whoever commits these sins of omission is demonizing Israel by giving the impression that the country wantonly desires war. And herein lies the difference between sincere criticism of the Israeli government and the other kind of criticism of Israel that is presently so widespread. In the former case, the special threats to the country are taken into account, while in the latter, this context of Israel's existence is denied or not mentioned. An example for such withholding of evidence is provided by a statement entitled "The Elephant in the Room," published by Bartov et al. In August 2023, in which criticism is directed solely at the Israeli occupation regime without any reference to Israel's enemies. 49 days after the publication of the statement, which garnered over 2,000 signatures in the space of a week, Hamas shocked the world with its massacre. It was Islamic anti-Semitism that now had revealed itself to be the real elephant in the room, as the factor that no one wants to see, although it affects everything. This specific blind spot has, however, remained in place post-7 October. Almost all the signatories of the elephant statement have said nothing further. Why? Is a Manichaean worldview, Israelis bad, Palestinians good, so essential to their identity that these signatories, I quote Günter Jekeli, must cling to that worldview even when the facts so obviously argue against it? Does a deeply ingrained anti-Semitic view prioritizes pre-existing beliefs over objective reality? This is obviously the case. Thus, most activists and academics do not want to hear about the disturbing reality that via the anti-Semitism of the Middle East, a piece of the Nazi past lives on in the present. In repudiating any references to the Shoah, Bartov and his co-signatories are fleeing from this fact. However, since October 7, it is no longer viable to separate Holocaust history from the present, nor can that massacre be understood by anyone who does not understand the Holocaust and the significance of the anti-Semitism that underlay it. Also, for this reason, October 7 should be the occasion for a scientifically grounded recall of the Holocaust and for opposition to attempts to relativize its historical significance or dismiss such remembrance as a fig leaf behind which the Israeli government seeks to hide alleged misdeeds. The months following the massacre have exposed a failure on the part of hitherto existing Holocaust education, which too has not wished to find out about the lasting impact of Nazi ideology in the Muslim world. Instead, it regarded the Holocaust as a completely closed chapter of history. In November 2023, Dani Dayan, chairman of Yad Vashem, admitted this, saying that, quote, "We at Yad Vashem are experts on Nazi ideology, but not in the barbarous ideology of Hamas. We have not investigated it," end quote. This should end. We must learn from the mistakes of the past. You all know that advance notice had been given to what happened on October 7. Hamas has never concealed its murderous plans. On the contrary, it has proclaimed the murder of Jews to be a religious duty. Quote, "We must attack every Jew on planet Earth," declared Hamas' former Interior Minister in Gaza, Fatih Hamad, in 2019 in a speech broadcast by the Hamas television station Al-Aqsa. "We must slaughter and kill them with Allah's help. We will lacerate them and tear them to pieces, Allah willing," end quote. And here is what Yahya Sinwar, the mastermind behind the October 7 attack, said at the end of 2022, quote, We will come to you with countless missiles. We will come to you in a boundless flood of soldiers. We will come to you with millions of our people like the returning flood. The global public, however, which annually commemorates the Holocaust, did or does not want to know anything about such statements or the threats in the Hamas Charter. Just as in 1933, the world refused to take Hitler's explicit Jew hatred seriously, now decades later it refused to take seriously the genocidal proclamations of Hamas and other Islamist groups. People behave as if Hamas does not really wish for what it calls for. And so it was that only Islamists foresaw and ardently prayed for the October 7 massacre. The rest of the world was taken by surprise. If we want to rise to the new challenge, every future Shoah commemoration should be an anti-Semitism commemoration that no longer taboos the genocidal Jew hatred that continues to live on after Auschwitz in the Middle East. At the same time, the struggle against anti-Semitism should always be conducted in such a way as to create a Holocaust awareness that embraces not only the uniqueness of the crime, but also the uniqueness of the hatred that made it possible. Let me end this talk with a final quote from Omar Bartov's essay of 2004. His text at the time concludes with the following words, quote, if a self-proclaimed liberation organization, meaning Hamas, calls for the extermination of the Jewish state, do not pretend that it is calling for anything else. The absence of clarity is the beginning of complicity. The absence of clarity is the beginning of complicity. That's true, isn't it? Thank you very much for your attention.